There's a moment in Shibuya Station, one frozen second where Satoru Gojo sees his dead friend's face and the entire architecture of reality pivots. 60 seconds. That's all the prison realm needed. 60 seconds of complete stillness within a 4-meter radius. For a man who processes cursed energy at molecular precision, whose brain operates at speeds that would shatter an ordinary mind, 60 seconds might as well be geological time. But Kenjaku understood something fundamental about the strongest sorcerer alive. His only vulnerability wasn't physical, it was human. What if that vulnerability never triggered? What if Gojo's 6 eyes caught the discrepancy in Geto's cursed energy signature 2 seconds earlier? The ceiling fails. Kenjaku's century-long plan collapses, and the question becomes far more unsettling than how many people survive Shibuya. The question becomes, what kind of world exists when one man is functionally unkillable, and he knows it? We talk about the Shibuya incident like it was a tragedy. 13 major deaths, thousands of civilians transformed into cursed spirits or burned alive by Sukuna's malevolent shrine. But strip away the emotional response and examine what actually happened that night. The ceiling wasn't just Kenjaku removing an obstacle, it was the Jujutsu world's immune system, rejecting a foreign body that had become too powerful to metabolize. Gojo's existence had rendered every other sorcerer functionally obsolete. His students trained knowing they'd never surpass him. The higher-ups made policy around containing him. Cursed spirits evolved specifically to counter his existence, forcing the entire ecosystem of cursed energy to mutate in response to one man. And he enjoyed it. The canonical Gojo loved fighting. Not protecting people, fighting. When he faced Toji and realized he'd been bested, his response wasn't grief over Riko's death, it was ecstasy at discovering his own mortality. The moment he unlocked reverse curse technique and became truly invincible, something calcified in him. He stopped relating to human limitation. The arrogance wasn't a flaw in his character, it was the inevitable psychological adaptation of a mind that had never experienced genuine threat. You can't empathize with fear when you've never felt afraid. You can't understand helplessness when you've never been powerless. So when our alternate timeline, where Gojo recognizes Kenjaku's deception instantly, where the prison realm snaps shut on empty air and Kenjaku flees into the night, what happens next isn't salvation, it's stagnation, crystallizing into something worse. The immediate aftermath seems positive. No Shibuya massacre, Sukuna remains dormant at 15 fingers, unwilling to reveal himself with Gojo active. Mahito gets hunted down within days. Kenjaku goes into hiding, his entire plan in ruins. The higher-ups continue their corrupt administration, but with Gojo is the nuclear deterrence preventing any major upheaval. Namini survives. Nobara keeps both eyes. Yuji doesn't break into that hollow, bloodthirsty thing we see in the culling game. The status quo holds. But the status quo was rotting from the inside. Gojo's stated goal was reforming the Jujutsu world through education, raising a generation strong enough to challenge the old guard. But examine his actual methodology. He protected his students by being an insurmountable wall between them and danger. He defied the higher-ups by being too powerful to punish. His entire revolution depended on him being the strongest, and because he was strongest, nothing fundamentally changed. The corrupt families remained in power. The higher-ups continued making decisions that got sorcerers killed. The system perpetuated itself because Gojo's existence paradoxically reinforced it. He was the reason the system didn't collapse, which meant it never needed to reform. His students would have grown, certainly. Megumi would have continued developing the 10 Shadows, Yuji would have learned to coexist with Sukuna, Nobara would have refined her technique, but none of them would have reached their potential. How could they? Every mission would have the implicit safety net of, if things get catastrophic, Gojo will handle it. Every deadly situation would be defanged by his intervention. They'd become stronger, but not strong enough, not desperate enough, not forced to transcend their limits because the alternative was death. Mahi's transformation never happens. In the canon timeline, losing Mai shattered her completely, but that devastation unlocked her heavenly restriction to its fullest extent, making her the equal of Toji. Without the chaos of Shibuya cascading into the culling game, without the pressure cooker of existential threat, she remains powerful, but limited, a first-grade sorcerer instead of something that defies categorization. Yuta doesn't return from Africa with the skills and power he developed in isolation. There's no emergency summoning him back because Gojo is sealed. He continues his training overseas, powerful, but ultimately redundant. Another special-grade sorcerer in a world where the strongest already exists.
Todo loses his boogie-woogie fighting Mahito, but in this timeline, Mahito dies quickly to Gojo's intervention. Todo keeps his technique. He also keeps his limitations. The crucible that would have forced him to evolve never occurs. Here's where it gets psychologically darker. Gojo's entire identity is constructed around being the strongest. It's not just confidence, it's the foundational truth of his existence. Throughout heaven and earth, I alone are the honored one. That statement, made after awakening his full power against Toji, isn't arrogance, it's diagnosis. He recognized he'd achieved a state of being that separated him from humanity. In the canon timeline, his sealing forced the next generation to rise. It validated his philosophy that others could become strong enough to continue without him. But if he's never sealed, he never gets that validation. He remains strongest, forever, and he knows it. More importantly, everyone else knows it. 50 years from now, when Gojo is in his 70s and his students are veteran sorcerers, they'll still be operating in his shadow. The Jujutsu world will still organize itself around his existence, and at some point, maybe gradually, maybe suddenly, the question becomes unavoidable. Why does he allow the higher-ups to exist at all? Gojo hates the sorcerer executives. He despises the corruption, the nepotism, the willingness to sacrifice young sorcerers for political convenience. He keeps them alive, not because he respects their authority, but because he believes his students should be the ones to dismantle the system. But if his students never become strong enough, never develop the political power or the raw force necessary to challenge the establishment, what then? The canonical Gojo had restraint born from ideology. He believed in reform through education, but that belief was never tested against decades of failure. In our timeline, where nothing changes, where the system continues grinding up young sorcerers year after year while he remains the strongest, does that restraint hold? Or does he finally do what he's always been capable of? Walk into the higher-ups' chambers and kill everyone there. Not in rage, not in a moment of passion, but as a calculated decision that he's the only one capable of forcing change, and he's wasted enough time pretending others would do it for him. And if he does that, when he does that, what stops him from continuing? The Zenin clan with their obsessive bloodline supremacy, the Kamo clan with their centuries of manipulation, every curse user operating in the shadows, every organization that perpetuates suffering through the Jujutsu world's power structures. He could dismantle it all in a month, kill everyone who represents the old order, install his students in positions of power, create his ideal society through overwhelming force. The terrifying part is he'd be right to do it. The system is corrupt. The higher-ups do get people killed. The noble families are obstacles to progress. Gojo's vision of a reformed Jujutsu world is objectively better than the status quo, but the mechanism of change would be one man deciding he's tired of waiting and imposing his will through violence,
not a revolution, a coup by someone who cannot be stopped. And this is where we arrive at the fundamental horror of Gojo's unchecked existence. Power doesn't corrupt him. Power reveals him. It reveals that beneath the playful sensei persona, beneath the stated ideology of fostering strong allies, there's a man who fundamentally believes he knows better than anyone else. Because he does know better, he's smarter, stronger, more capable than anyone alive. The problem isn't that he's wrong about his superiority. The problem is that being correct about your superiority doesn't grant you the right to impose your vision on everyone else.
But who would stop him? Yuki Tsukumo might object on philosophical grounds, Kenjaku would be in hiding, Sukuna at 15 fingers wouldn't risk a direct confrontation. The international Jujutsu community couldn't coordinate a response before he dismantled their power structures too. There's no check on his power, no balance, just his self-restraint, which has been wearing thinner with every year the system fails to change. Megumi becomes the most psychologically damaged in this scenario. His entire character arc is about escaping Gojo's shadow while respecting his strength. But if Gojo never gets sealed, Megumi never gets the chance to stand on his own. He remains Gojo's student. His 10 Shadows technique, which should have evolved into summoning Maharaga as a trump card, stays underdeveloped because every fight that would push him to that extreme ends with Gojo's intervention. And if Gojo goes through with killing the higher-ups, Megumi has to reconcile his respect for his sensei with watching him become exactly what Megumi feared, someone who uses overwhelming power to impose their will. Consequences be damned. Yuji's psychological state might be actually worse than the canonical timeline. In canon, the Shibuya massacre traumatizes him into becoming a more effective killer, hollow but functional. In this alternate timeline, he never develops that edge. He remains idealistic, believing in the value of proper deaths and saving people. But he's watching Gojo gradually lose patience with the system, watching his sensei, the person who saved him from execution, slowly transform into something more ruthless, and Yuji, whose entire moral framework is built on saving lives even at personal cost, has to confront the possibility that sometimes the right thing to do involves killing the people in power. The real nightmare scenario emerges around year 3 of this timeline. Kenjaku hasn't abandoned his plans, he's reformulating. He can't seal Gojo, but he can still advance his agenda if he's patient. He begins activating cursed objects remotely, awakening dormant sorcerers across Japan. Not the mass activation of the culling game, but surgical insertions designed to create chaos without drawing Gojo's immediate attention. Small cults worshipping Sukuna, curse users gathering fragments of powerful cursed objects, a distributed network of threats that Gojo can't address simultaneously. And Gojo, frustrated by years of systemic failure and now facing a metastasizing crisis he can't solve by simply being strongest, makes the decision. He goes to the higher-ups and gives them an ultimatum: reform the system completely, grant his students authority, dismantle the noble family's power structures, or he'll do it himself. They refuse because they're corrupt and short-sighted and believe their political maneuvering can somehow contain him. They're wrong. Gojo kills them all in one afternoon. Not brutally, he's not cruel, but efficiently, using his limitless technique to simply erase them from existence. No suffering, just sudden termination of everyone who represented the old order. Then he moves on to the noble families, the Zenin compound, the Camo estate, anyone who would resist his reformation. He's not trying to kill civilians, he's surgically removing the power structures that perpetuate suffering. But precision doesn't eliminate the fundamental reality. He's imposing his vision through mass execution. His students have to choose.
Support his coup because the higher-ups genuinely were corrupt and the system needed dismantling, or oppose him because this is exactly the kind of might makes right philosophy that creates tyrants. Yuji likely tries to stop him, fails, obviously, because no one can stop Gojo, but the attempt itself fractures their relationship. Megumi might support him out of pragmatism. The system was broken, someone had to break it further to rebuild. Nobara would be caught between them, seeing both perspectives and hating that there's no clean answer. The international Jujutsu community responds eventually. Other nations can't allow one sorcerer to unilaterally reshape Japan's power structure because it sets a precedent. If Gojo can execute his country's leadership, what stops other special grades from doing the same? They organize a coalition, not to kill him, they know that's impossible, but to contain him, isolate Japan, cut off resources, turn him into a pariah state unto himself. And Gojo, now functionally the dictator of Japan's jujutsu world, has to maintain order while facing international opposition. His students, instead of becoming revolutionaries who change the system from within, have become administrators of their sensei's authoritarian reformation. They're implementing good policies, dismantling corruption, providing support for young sorcerers, creating pathways for advancement outside noble bloodlines, but the foundation is violence. The entire structure rests on one man's decision that he knew better and had the power to enforce it. Kenjaku watches all of this with satisfaction, not because his original plan succeeded, but because he's achieved something potentially more useful. He's transformed Gojo from a protector to an authoritarian. The strongest sorcerer is now isolated, politically poisoned, leading a system built on his absolute power. And absolute power, even when wielded by someone with good intentions, creates brittleness. The moment Gojo isn't there, through death, distraction, or simply being unable to be everywhere at once, the entire structure collapses. Which brings us to the final evolution of this timeline. Gojo, now in his 30s, ruling over a reformed but authoritarian jujutsu society, facing international isolation and underground resistance from curse users who've learned to operate beneath his detection threshold. His students are powerful but psychologically compromised by their complicity in his coup. The noble families still exist, but neutered, resentful, waiting for any opportunity to reclaim power. And Sukuna remains sealed inside Yuji, growing stronger with each absorbed finger, patient as only something ancient can be patient, waiting for the perfect moment to exploit the brittleness Kenjaku engineered. The question stops being what if Gojo was never sealed, and becomes what happens when the strongest person alive realizes being strongest isn't enough to create lasting change. Because power can destroy systems, but it can't build them. Fear can enforce compliance, but it can't generate loyalty. Gojo's reformation, built on his individual strength, is inherently unstable. And he knows it. He's intelligent enough to recognize he's created a house of cards with himself as the foundation. So he does what he's always done. He pushes his students harder, forces them to become strong enough to maintain the system without him. But now, there's no growth through adversity, no crucible of genuine threat, just increasingly intense training that never quite replicates the desperation of real combat. They grow stronger, but not strong enough. Never strong enough. Because they're training in a world where Gojo has eliminated most genuine threats, and the remaining ones have learned to hide. The psychological toll on Gojo himself is the darkest element. He's achieved everything he wanted, reformed the system, protected his students, dismantled corruption, but he's done it through violence and authoritarian control. The playful, confident sensei persona becomes harder to maintain. He's not depressed or regretful. Those emotions require believing you made the wrong choice. He believes he made the only choice. But there's a weariness that sets in. The knowledge that he'll be doing this forever. Maintaining order through overwhelming force. being the strongest until he dies, at which point everything he built collapses because it was all built around him. And then, Sukuna makes his move. Not through direct confrontation, he learned from Jogo's mistake that fighting Gojo at 15 fingers is suicide, but through manipulation. He starts offering deals to Yuji during moments of exhaustion. Let me out for 1 hour, and I'll handle that curse user network Gojo can't locate. Give me control briefly, and I'll eliminate that international coalition before they attack. Yuji refuses initially, but the offers keep coming, and they're tempting, because Yuji can see what his sensei has become, can see the cost of Gojo's reformation, and Sukuna is offering a different path. Not better, just different. If Yuji accepts, even once, everything unravels. Sukuna gets enough freedom to begin undermining Gojo's authority, not through combat, but through political maneuvering. He starts making deals with curse users, offering them protection from Gojo in exchange for loyalty, building a counterpower structure in the shadows. And because Gojo has made so many enemies through his authoritarian reformation, Sukuna finds willing collaborators everywhere. The final confrontation wouldn't be physical, it would be ideological. Gojo, who reformed society through overwhelming power, facing Sukuna, who's offering people an alternative to living under Gojo's benevolent tyranny. And the horrifying part is Sukuna's alternative is objectively worse. He doesn't care about human suffering at all. But people choose it anyway, because living under a system you hate by choice feels better than living under a system you might agree with but was imposed through violence. The absolute worst-case scenario is Gojo recognizing this trap, seeing that his reformation, built on his individual power, has created the conditions for Sukuna's rise, and he can't undo it, can't step back without the system collapsing, can't continue without feeding Sukuna's growing countermovement. He's trapped by his own strength, forced to maintain an authoritarian structure he created with good intentions, watching it metastasize into exactly the kind of oppressive system he originally wanted to destroy. In the canonical timeline, Gojo's sealing was a tragedy, but it was a tragedy that forced growth, that created space for others to rise, that demonstrated strength doesn't have to come from one person. In this alternate timeline, his continued presence is a different kind of tragedy, one where being correct about your superiority and having the power to enforce your vision doesn't create a better world. It creates a brittle, authoritarian structure that will collapse the moment you're gone, maintained only by fear and force, breeding the next generation of resentment that will tear it all down. The uncomfortable truth this scenario reveals is that Gojo being sealed wasn't just bad luck or Kenjaku's brilliance, it was necessary. Not morally necessary, the deaths in Shibuya were senseless tragedies, but narratively, systemically necessary, because a world where one person is so overwhelmingly powerful that they can't be challenged doesn't evolve, it stagnates, and stagnation, even under benevolent control, eventually rots into something far worse than the chaos of competing powers. Gojo's greatest strength, his overwhelming, unchallengeable supremacy, is also the reason he could never actually reform the Jujutsu world. Real change requires vulnerability. It requires systems built on cooperation and mutual support, rather than one person's unassailable power. The moment Gojo became truly invincible, he lost the ability to create lasting change. He could destroy the old system, which he does in this timeline, but he can't build the new one, because building requires trust, and trust requires risk, and risk requires the possibility of failure. And Gojo hasn't known genuine risk since he was 17 years old. So the answer to "what if Gojo was never sealed" isn't a story of salvation. It's a story of gradual corruption, not of Gojo's morals, but of the entire system he creates. A world where the strongest person decides what's right and enforces it through unchallengeable power, where his students never truly grow because they never face genuine desperation, where the system reforms through violence and maintains itself through fear, where international pressure and underground resistance slowly build toward inevitable conflict, and where Sukuna waits patiently, knowing that a structure built on one person's strength will collapse the moment that person makes a single mistake or shows a moment of weakness. That 60-second hesitation in Shibuya Station wasn't Gojo's failure. It was the last moment he was still human enough to hesitate when confronted with the impossible. Everything that came after, the ceiling, the massacre, his students' desperate growth, the culling game, his eventual death, was the cost of being human. Removing that human moment doesn't create a better timeline. It creates one where Gojo stops being human at all, and the world pays the price for being ruled by someone who's transcended human limitation but never learned to transcend human error in judgment. The strongest person alive can protect others from external threats, but they can't protect themselves from slowly, inevitably becoming exactly what they fought against, an unchallengeable authority imposing their vision on everyone else, convinced that being right and being powerful means being justified. The question was never whether Gojo's ceiling was a tragedy. It was whether his absence created worse tragedy than his continued presence would have. And the answer, examined coldly, is that both timelines are tragic. One through catastrophic violence and desperate growth, the other through gradual authoritarianism and systemic stagnation. But only one timeline had the possibility of genuine change. Only one forced the next generation to rise. Only one broke the cycle of depending on the strongest person to solve every problem. And it was the timeline where Gojo looked at his dead friend's face and hesitated just long enough for the prison realm to seal him. That 60-second hesitation of humanity cost thousands of lives, but it also proved that strength alone can never be enough, that real power comes from building systems that outlast individuals, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is fail so others learn they can succeed without you. So now you understand why some tragedies are necessary, why the worst thing that could happen to the Jujutsu world was Gojo remaining unsealed. Comment your thoughts below. Do you think Gojo would have actually gone authoritarian, or am I reading too dark into his character? Subscribe for more psychological deep dives into anime's darkest what-if scenarios. Next video breaks down something even more unsettling. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next Paradox.